good morning, good afternoon, and good evening around our sweating, feverish world. And today we have intellectual and business and economic antibiotics to give you. We have solutions. We have uh, first class analyst, a figure of remarkable distinction, as I've described him before, a Renaissance man, Karl Mayer, is an expert on energy. He's an expert on restructuring of companies. And hopefully we can get onto that too, because the arteriosclerosis of management in America has reached critical mass over the past quarter century. And Carl is a leading expert on what's supposed to be the impossible and how to help American companies climb out of this maze. And we will be asking him precisely how that can be done. But first of all, management consultant. He's in major corporations have benefited and been saved by his interventions, by his assessments, by his analysis, and by his recommendations. And he's just published a new book on the age of upheaval and restructuring we are now in. It's called Surfing Economic Chaos. Carl, what's it about? What lessons should we take from it? Exactly.
Very good. Yes, the world's in flux right now. We're in a period of amazing change, and I think people are seeing that in the daily news and getting a real, personal sense of that impact in many ways on their daily life. And so I find that change can produce a lot of stress. In some cases, it can also produce opportunities. And for many people, perhaps not all, but for many people, I do see opportunities, particularly for small businesses to adapt and take advantage of because change does play to smaller companies as opposed to the incumbent, behemoths, in many ways.
How do small entrepreneurs look for change? What should they be looking for?
Well, I think there's several major trends that are long just aren't going to immediately reverse. And so I think looking at what those are is a great first step to say where might be the opportunities for my company, for my business. So, the demographic shift is a major theme, on all the continents. The urbanization, since World War II has changed the number of births per the population demographics. So I think that's a big thing we're seeing. With the recent events in the both Ukraine and the Strait of Hormuz, we're seeing the changes in energy dynamics. That's probably a long-term trend as well. The change in the role of the United States in protecting world trade is another thing. The navies of the world have changed, particularly, like the U.S. and Britain's have changed the type of ships, and their ability to protect world trade has changed. And I think, some of that's what we're seeing in places like Hormuz. So that has wide-reaching consequences as well. And so I think these are some of the kind of primary shifts, and then there's secondary effects on that. What does that mean for agriculture? What does that mean for chemicals? What does that mean for, plastics and consumer goods? And from the demographics, what does that mean from the things like the accumulation of capital changes as you age? And so I think we really, as we start to get into the second order effects, we get all sorts of opportunities coming up.
Wow.
Can you recommend any of those opportunities for us? What are, let's say, three or four or more that strike you?
Well, one thing that I think we're going to see globally just impact people, at anything from, large investments all the way down to personal budgets is two different trends, both of them kind of tied to the demographics, are going to push inflation. One is, as baby boomers start to, pass away and they're eating right now until they do, they're spending down their savings. So that's changing the amount of net savings in the system. For decades, their 401, their retirement funds have been adding to capital around the world, and now they're effectively shrinking capital by eating that down. Well, that less capital, less supply of capital, that will increase the cost of capital. So higher interest rates probably could lead to higher inflation. Similarly, if you look at the trades in the United States, like welders and electricians and so forth, they for every seven one of the tradespeople that retire over the next 5 years, there's only about three that are coming into the market from the younger generation. So that's an example of the change in the labor market. So there's less. So that again, you get a similar thing, less supply of labor drives up the price of labor. We're seeing inflation nudge up, and I think these trends are just going to continue going forward. So, if you're a business person, understanding that costs are changing. I talked to someone the other day who was thinking about starting a business to get welders, to supply welders because he's been hearing about these companies that are looking for welders. And I was like, well, that's a good idea. Where are you going to get the welders from? Where are you going to find them? The challenge now isn't finding the customers in that market as much as it is finding the labor to supply those customers. And so, what, that could, that could be a lot of different possibilities on how you solve that problem, but that's the type of opportunity as we change the nature of the labor force. What can you do to attract laborers so that you can solve your customers' needs? That's a huge opportunity that can be, taken advantage of at nearly any scale.
So
If
your
I can
book is,
follow up on,
sorry.
oh, sorry, if I can follow up on that, Carl, to me that's a fascinating point because I've studied the rise of industrial America and industrial Germany in the industrial revolution, the electrochemical revolution from 1870 through to beyond World War II. And in both cases, the key to success was not starting with mass immigration of people coming in as cheap sources of labor. But in Germany, you had the enormous population losses in World War One and in World War II as well. Yet Germany boomed more than ever and was more prosperous than ever after World War II. In the United States, a similar story. They cut off, for political reasons and reasons of bigotry as well, mass immigration from Europe and even the rest of the world in 1924. Well, the results of these were exactly what you just said, that skilled labor became much more in demand. It was difficult to find it. And as a result, nevertheless, America and Germany flourished because they emphasized upgrading technical education, producing precisely what you said, more workers, more electricians, more welders, more shipyard workers, more skilled, entire generations of skilled people in the auto and aircraft and high-tech industries. And this produced an enormous development. So is that a way for us to go in the future in Europe and possibly later in the United States too, to try and compensate for, not by bringing in more unskilled third world labor, but by upgrading the labor force we already have in technical education?
I certainly think that's a good path to follow. Will it solve all the problems? Probably not, but it certainly is a tool. It's a step in the right direction. I completely agree. for sure. But the challenge of bringing people in at this point, from immigration, one of the questions is, where do you bring people from? So, for decades, the U.S. brought people from Mexico. Well, Mexico is to the point where they no longer have surplus young people. And that's actually been true for about 15 years. And so net migration between the US and Mexico has been towards Mexico for almost every year for the last 15 years.
Wow.
What is attracting the immigration back to Mexico? Because this, you've done it again. Every time we have you on, you bring on bombshells. You bring on enormous developments that all the major news organizations and economic analysts in the world have missed. And yet, once you point them out, they ought to be obvious. Why are people going back to Mexico?
Well, 20, 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, the birth rate in Mexico declined as they began to urbanize. And so with that lower birth rate, they've got people who are in their 40s and 50s who are buying things, so they've got a strong consumer market, and they need people to produce and provide both services and goods
Yes.
to provide for that demand. And so now those workers don't have to go to the United States to get a quality job. They can stay in their culture and with their families and work there at a reasonable wage. And over the last 5 or so years, we're seeing the same thing in the Central American countries, in El Salvador and Honduras and Costa Rica and so forth, that they also are aging to the point where they don't need to send their workers to the United States to find those quality jobs. They have enough quality jobs in their countries. So what the US is seeing now is more like Chinese coming in from, some of them come into like Ecuador and then go all the way up to get to the United States. So you're seeing, and I guess at the beginning of the Ukraine war, we saw a lot of Ukrainians coming in. So you're seeing immigration from other sources than the traditional Mexico, Central American sources that the US is used to. So yeah, as one thing shifts in Mexico, that affects the United States, and so yeah, it's amazing how it all flows together.
The world that you paint is one of incredible complexity. I mean, it exists whether you write about it or not, but just talking to you is like you get a sense of vertigo because everything has second and third order effects, hasn't it? And we
Yes.
can't control it, can we really? I mean, or can we? We can only control our little side. We can only um, I mean, we believe in control. That's the basic Western idea to get ahead. And yet, in a free market capitalist society of great complexity that the West is, there is huge amount of chaos. So how can you combine the two? I mean, the way I see it is your book is basically a way. It's a manual for somebody, a would-be employee or worker or entrepreneur to navigate this world of incredible complexity, right?
Mhm.
And how do you do that in a simple way? I mean, you're not, do you just make them aware of that, or do you sort of map out a small world they can make their own, or a model, a modus operandi to go about things, how to live a life in a world of complexity?
Right. Well, the world's complex, whether we like it or not. We all use simplifying assumptions to make sense of chaos that's certainly beyond my comprehension. But if we make a balanced, if we don't oversimplify to just an exceptional degree, if we recognize that there are some trends moving out there, we can focus on those few trends,
Right,
and we don't necessarily have to explore every third order implication
right,
of those trends. But the principle that I'm encouraging people to follow is to acknowledge one or two of these key trends, maybe even a handful of them, but a certain number of these key trends and say, how does this impact my little world? If I'm a small manufacturer, I've got a machine shop, in, you know, Austin, Texas, or if I've got a custom circuit board
Yes.
manufacturer in the East Coast, what does that mean to me?
Mm,
And so that narrows it down quite a bit. Okay, I've got to deal with inflation, I got to deal with tight labor, and maybe, those chips I'm used to getting from China may need to seek some alternate sourcing for that. Okay, if I say these are the key three things that I expect to impact my world, given that, okay, now I've
mm,
got a problem. I might be able to, talk to some advisors and, bounce some ideas off of, my customers, talk to suppliers and go, okay, here's the path that might work for me. As opposed to just saying, I'm going to assume things are just going to stay the way they were
mm,
and we'll see what happens.
mm,
And that may not be the best course.
When we look at both the small businessmen as you've been focusing on, and also I know you've done a great deal of work on the restructure, advising and trying to help larger corporations deal with changes in the world too. 25 years ago at United Press International, we brought in one high price management consultant after another to try and come up with models to make profits out of what was very clearly becoming the new online journalism world, the world in which you and I and Pelle are now communicating right now. And they did not have a clue, none of them. And they weren't that old exactly. They were, I think you've probably seen far more of these people than I have or than Pele has. But they were bright people, they were serious people, but they were living in a world of old behemoths, of old corporations, and they really did not have a clue how the new media, which was utterly chaotic in ways that you are describing the whole world as being today, clearly was. Now, since then, models have emerged, examples have emerged, huge success stories have emerged from Amazon.com, the ultimate behemoth in retail, uh, to relatively small models that start from nowhere and reach hundreds of thousands of people on the net and do extremely well, even often started by one or two people. In fact, the inspiration for what Pele and I are trying to do in our own very modest way. But when you look at this evolution in the past and you look at the broader global picture now, are there lessons that we can learn from this of what kind of innovation succeeds or what to look for in innovation when you're starting small and looking for opportunity?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think one of the just like you said, when we with the internet that transformed the way we communicate and the way we can gather information, social media's done extraordinary things with all its implications, good, bad, and indifferent. I think if we just look at, for example, labor right now, I think that's a huge shift change. I grew up in a world where you better work really hard to outcompete the next guy just to have a job. I was kind of the trail end of the baby boom, and so there was all these people who already had more experience than me. They were a little older, and they were working hard to keep their job, and so you better work really hard. I look at, um, I've got a stepson who's 20 years old right now. And for him, the world looks completely different. If he wants a job, he just walks down the street and, he sees help wanted signs everywhere. If he can go get a job at a restaurant, if he wants to do programming, well, right now programming with AI is a little complicated, but there's a ton, if he wanted a job as an electrician, he doesn't need any school. He can get a kind of an apprenticeship just right away. So it's a completely different perspective. So as an employer, as an entrepreneur, as a business owner or manager, how are you going to deal with that? I think that's the type of shift that's as large as what you were talking about with the media impact on media. So employers, when I was, you know, coming into the labor market, were like, here's the job, here's when you're going to work, and here's how you're
Yes.
going to do it. And like it or hit the road, Jack. I got three people waiting to take your spot. Now it's the opposite. It's what do I do to attract? And you, at the large enterprise level, um, if you look at the commercial market for real estate in the U.S., Class A buildings are in high demand. The top
Yes.
tier buildings are in high demand, but Class B and C and D are like, they're in trouble. They can't find, and it's because the big companies want people to come back to the office. Well, you better provide a very nice office setting to attract people to come back to the office. And I think there's a lot of things, obviously not every company is going to be able to afford that type of Class A amenity, Class A office amenity, but there's a lot of things you can do at a human level. You can train your supervisors and you can directly supervise differently and you can offer things as a small business that are at a human scale that, even that big company may or may not be able to match. So I think that's a huge transition.
Well,
If I
okay.
can chime in there, I mean, I see that in very close in my own life. My son is a business executive in construction, and the company, what he never took his although he's highly intelligent and talented, he never took academia seriously. But he just turns out to be very good at organizing and running the building, and especially the exactly what you said, Karl, the modernization and renovation and refurbishment of old major office buildings. And the company he works for, he's in huge demand with them. In a sense, he's finding he's in so much demand with them. He's actually looking to move on. And again, this fits exactly the model that you're saying when you have not just trained workers but trained and experienced management, when you're working in an economy which doesn't have enough cheap labor and puts a premium on more skilled labor, and therefore skills labor actually has to be paid more. And what this also in turn does is it generates innovation. People think of the Black Death in the 1350s and the Great Renaissance in Italy and Europe, that Western Europe that followed it 50 years later, as being separate events. They were not. All of a sudden, as you know, skilled workers came in demand. Skilled workers were paid more than they had ever been before. And they finally had the leisure, the disposable income, enough food to buy every day themselves, to be more enough time to think, to be more creative, and this generated hundreds of years of prosperity and technological and scientific growth for the West. Because it's only when people get paid more money that industry and science, and eventually even art too, flourish as a result. But it all starts from needing more workers and therefore being forced to treat your workers better and paying them more money. And this is what you're telling us, that innovation is coming and it's here and it's starting at the bottom. Is that a reasonable way of putting it?
I agree. I agree. Yes. Um,
Um,
but
can I just say something?
Uh,
But I mean, because the assumption was that there's my assumption was that there's scarcity of jobs, and you seem to be saying, well, there's that young people are in demand. I mean, the sort of back of my mind sort of metric that I'm running in all my interviews is basically the baby boomers are dying out, but young people are not going to have it as good. They're going to die younger. They can't get on the housing ladder. AIs and mass immigration is making their jobs redundant. You know, lawyers and accountants can't do their jobs in London because can't get on the feet on the bottom rungs of the professional ladder because AI can do all those routine jobs that they used to do and so on. But here you're saying Well, actually, it's quite good for Generation Z. They can actually they're in demand, so that employers are actually sucking up to them. And they can pick and choose. So, which is it?
Well, you bring up an excellent point. And I do see a dichotomy there.
Yes.
Um, I see roughly, just on an anecdotal observation, I see half of the Gen Z who are, have opportunities, who are getting, in demand. People are hiring them up as quickly as possible. But I also see a number of the Gen Zers who are not seeing the world as preventing them with the opportunities they want. Like you say, the housing is incredibly
Yeah.
unaffordable. And, and I'm going to kind of incriminate social media to a certain degree about setting comparative expectations and all sorts of, potential disinformation. So I agree there is kind of a problem, there's a problem there as well as
Hmm.
some very good things going on. And it's not a simple yes, no.
This idea that, in the past, people were focused on having families, and so they could become, manufacturers of circuit boards in Austin, and it wasn't an uncool thing to do. But now everybody wants to be an influencer or something, or a YouTuber. Everybody wants to be a chief, and then wants to be an Indian and do those unglamorous job, unglamorous as it were. And everybody's got a university education now, so they enormously raised expectations. But I don't think intelligence has increased. So you've got in my dad's generation, you had 2% of the population going to university. So they were always able to walk into a job that according to their expectations. Now you have these mass expectation generating machines at our universities without the jobs to go with it. So you've got the sort of the precariat, I think it's called. That is, people in precarious jobs all want to be actors or philosophers or whatever, and they end up working in this some crap job, or and they don't even look at the kind of industrial jobs that we all need, that the West
Ex-
needs to compete. So it's
Same
like,
here.
yeah.
I see in my old age, I've had the enormous good fortune to meet you, Karl. And when I was young, I never met, but I was hugely influenced by the late longshoreman philosopher Erich Hoffer. And Erich Hoffer was a longshoreman most of his life in San Francisco. He was a big, tough, mean guy. And he wrote classic books on political extremism and religious fanaticism, like The True Believer and The Temper of Our Times, and even on the nature of change and adapting to change. And he loved America. But the America he loved was not the America we have seen of the past 80 years. It was the pragmatic, exactly what Pelle just said and what you've described too. It was the roll up your sleeves, get the jobs done, technically innovative America, full of people who weren't looking to be mass influencers or actors or philosophers, who were looking precisely to be better welders. And people like Henry Ford, you tinker around with an engine. He was regarded as a crackpot till he was 50 years old. And then he puts it all together and he comes up with a Model T. And, understandably never looks back. And but in the last 80 years, we disdain pragmatism, and instead everybody wants to be Einstein. Duh. Well, who the expert who deleted was Einstein. Yeah, I mean, we should have shows. I'd love to have you on it too, on what Einstein got wrong, which was a lot leading us up the garden path. And he didn't actually do anything. He was a thinker. But thinking isn't important. Practicalities are important. And this is what you're pointing at. And you work in a world of practicalities. Is that a reasonable point to put it? And if I may also go on from this, and that is, uh, can big corporations be saved? Depending on the circumstances, and if so, how? If they are entangled in old ways of thinking, how can you? I know you've tried to help many get out of old ways of thinking. Clearly, in some cases, you have succeeded. How did you succeed?
Yeah, it's a new, the changing world requires a certain fresh look at things, a new
Yes.
paradigm, if you will. And, you know, it's the nature of paradigms. Some people are ready to adapt and some people never adapt. So I try and focus on the people who want to adapt and are willing to look at some new opportunities.
But I think that's a huge point right there. And it also goes back to the point Pelle was making before of this dichotomy. We're in a world of both winners and losers at the same time. But I mean, you find this in the Gospels. Jesus says, to him who increases his talents, I'll give more talents. And if you just sit on what you've got, not even if you lose it, but if you're basically a European socialist bureaucrat and you just sit there and you play safe, Jesus says, get out, I'm firing you. I mean, and of course, the Christian movement, the Christian church that Jesus founded, swept the world, swept the world. Is that a possible analogy?
Oh, I think that's a fantastic analogy. I mean, there was a huge shift in mindset, and it took a long, long time to really fully, be accepted across the world. And yeah, it was massive. You're on mute.
Christianity is enormously successful. We ought to follow that. I mean, just as a business model or an intellectual model. But we've got to wind
Yes.
up there, I'm afraid, Karl. So just tell us where we can find your book and sort of summarize it for an audience that arrived late.
Absolutely. So, surfing economic chaos, how American businesses can prosper despite the collapse of globalization. So, that's on Amazon, Surfing Economic Chaos. You can look it up, and you can certainly find me on LinkedIn. It's an easy way to do that.
Well, it's wonderful to have you on, Karl. We've got to have you on again. I
Here,
mean, there's so
here.
many topics I feel that
Exactly.
the doors are half open and they wait to be walked through intellectually. So I hope you'll be able to come on again. Thank you so much. And thank you, Martin.